Good evening, and welcome to tonight's virtual fireside, the fourth in the series entitled Joseph Smith, A Life Lived in Crescendo. We're very pleased to be hearing a presentation from Ronald K. Esplin entitled All the Measures of Joseph, Keys and Continuity in the Succession of 1844. We're grateful that Ron is willing to answer questions after the presentation. To submit questions, please text 208-991-0315 anytime during the presentation. Please don't wait until the very end. The sooner you send your question, the more likely we'll be able to get to it. Our opening prayer will be given by Ron's son, John Esplin. Following the prayer, we'll have an introduction by Richard E. Turley. Before his retirement, Rick served as assistant church historian and later as managing director of the church's public affairs department.
Our dear Heavenly Father, at this time, as we prepare for this fireside, we thank Thee for all of our blessings. We thank Thee for the opportunity to learn and to grow in our strength and knowledge about this church, about its founding, and about its history. We thank Thee as well for all of the knowledge that You have been able to present to us through miraculous ways so that we can learn and know our history. We also ask Thee at this time to please bless our speaker. Give him the strengths of word and knowledge that he will be able to enlighten and share and offer insights that will touch each and every one of us. We also ask You at this time to please bless those in attendance, that we will really be able to listen to these words and learn and grow and understand God's love and God's plan for all of us. We ask You this time to watch over our missionaries and watch over the missionary work and allow this to be a part of that effort. We thank Thee for the technology that we're able to leverage tonight to spread this word, and we say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Welcome to this evening's fireside, All the Measures of Joseph, Keys and Continuity in the Succession of 1844, which will be presented by Ronald K. Esplin. Ron received degrees in history from the University of Utah, from the University of Virginia, and from Brigham Young University. He spent 8 years as a historian in the history division of the Church Historical Department and 25 years as professor of church history and senior research historian at the Joseph Fielding Smith Institute for Latter-day Saint History at BYU, 16 of those years as director of the institute. From 2002 to 2012, he served as managing editor of the Joseph Smith Papers. The prophet Joseph Smith knew that Nauvoo provided his final opportunity to finish the foundation of the restoration and complete the mission he had been given. When a majority of the members of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles returned to Nauvoo after their British missions, Joseph announced that the 12 would now oversee with the First Presidency the entire church. From that point on, Brigham Young and his fellow apostles were involved in all aspects of church governance and development. Ron's presentation offers an overview of how these new assignments, responsibilities, and opportunities prepared Brigham Young and the Quorum of the 12 to carry the burden in the heat of the day, even in Joseph's absence and after his death. Ron's presentation follows up on earlier work he has published, and I trust you will find it both informative and uplifting. The succession of keys restored to Joseph Smith and passed down to present leaders is a key doctrine of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. As one who worked for decades with those holding these keys, I bear witness to the continual revelation that guides the church today.
I'm pleased to be with you this evening and have the chance to revisit a topic that I've cared about for a long time. That is the succession, the apostolic succession of 1844. As Rick said, this is billed as somewhat of revisiting something that I did much earlier, so I thought it would be appropriate to comment about that earlier piece. In that earlier piece, I argued that succession as it happened, as it unfolded on the ground, is often misunderstood and misrepresented. The idea that's sometimes presented is that after a prolonged crisis, Brigham Young, through cunning and luck, managed somehow to overcome all rivals and come out on top. But that is not the story that I find grounded in the history. There was not a prolonged crisis, nor multiple claimants trying to be heard. After the initial devastating, shocking, disorienting loss of Joseph, the question was, how could the church possibly survive without Joseph? The saints were forced to reconsider, and after the 12 returned and presented their case, for many, indeed for most, the decision was relatively straightforward. That's because on the question of authority, who had Joseph confided in, leaned on, and prepared to lead in his absence with all the keys, no one in Nauvoo in 1844 could or did offer a case comparable to that of Brigham Young and the 12. Similarly, on the question of who the saints had confidence in, there was no rival in Nauvoo in 1844. In the earlier article, I argued that not only did those who sought an alternative not do so based primarily on the question of authority, they did so mostly because the minorities sought a way to hang on to the Restoration, continue their love for the Book of Mormon without embracing some of the great, what we see as the final teachings of Joseph Smith in Nauvoo. They were seeking a way to hold on to the earlier Latter-day Saint teachings they'd known without embracing the temple and all the things that went with it in Joseph Smith's last years in Nauvoo. Now, I'm not suggesting, I didn't then and I don't now, that it was easy or foreordained. There was no precedent. Many things might have gone awry. But the backstory of how Brigham Young and the 12 were prepared to lead and why the saints so quickly supported them makes for a different story than one of deep and lasting succession crisis. Now, while talking about back then, when that earlier article of mine was published, I want to mention that it came on the heels of an article by a friend and colleague of mine, Michael Quinn, who wrote what is often seen as a standard work on the succession crisis of 1844, which is what he called his article. It's a fine piece of research. That was my view of it at the time and still is. And that it sheds little light, I thought then, and still do, on succession as it unfolded in 1844, because instead it catalogs mostly hypothetical alternatives paths for succession. For example, David Whitmer. In 1834, Joseph Smith ordained David Whitmer to be his successor should he not live to God or should he die. Had Joseph Smith died in 1834, David Whitmer would have been a strong contender and possibly his successor. But that was not operative in 1844. Another example is Oliver Cowdery, who was surely a potential successor, having received, as Richard Anderson said, as the second witness of priesthood restoration, all of the keys with Joseph Smith, who could have been a stronger possible successor, and he was still alive. But after 1844, January the 19th, the revelation of 1844, which we'll talk about, that was not an option, as Oliver himself acknowledged when he returned to the church in 1848. So that's another hypothetical or non-operative alternative to Brigham Young and the Quorum of the 12 in 1844. In only one case do I argue with Michael's research, and that's on Samuel Smith, younger brother of Joseph and Hiram. He unfortunately died right after they were killed. Had he lived, he would have been a successor, not to Joseph, but to Hiram as patriarch. So again, I say there were no authorized, prepared men on the ground with all the keys in Nauvoo in 1844, except Brigham Young and the Quorum of the 12. And I hope this preamble will help you understand that I'm going to talk then about how they became prepared to be in the place to do what they needed to do. Joseph knew when he founded Nauvoo that he had little time and a final chance, as Rick mentioned, a final chance to fulfill his mission. I cataloged some of this in an article I wrote some time ago called Joseph Smith's Mission and Timetable. From at least 1839, Joseph Smith knew that his time was short, and he referenced this many times in Nauvoo. Richard Anderson wrote an article in 1980, which he called Joseph Smith's Premonitions of Martyrdom. I will mention one of those premonitions that has been my favorite that he gave to the Relief Society. I'll mention that a little bit later. But one that he didn't mention that I've always enjoyed since I uncovered it in the diary of Wilford Woodruff is Wilford Woodruff's recording on the 28th of July, 1844, as he and members of his quorum returned to Nauvoo or toward Nauvoo from the east, a discussion with Lyman White, who had been in jail with Joseph, had been one of his jailmates in Liberty Jail. Lyman said it, and Wilford wrote it down. Joseph told me in Liberty Jail, "You may take this as a prophecy, but do not tell it until I am gone. I shall not live to see 40. And of course, we know that he died at the age of 38 and a half. So Joseph went into Nauvoo knowing that his time was limited. But the saints did not understand that. If they ever thought about it at all, they probably thought he could not be killed. He would not be killed. Sometimes he boasted, "God will protect me." At least his critics took it as a boast and didn't hear him often add, "I will not be taken until my mission is done." But the saints did not understand that that mission was indeed unfolding, and that the things that were essential for his wrapping up his mission were ongoing even as he spoke. Joseph knew his time was short and he prepared. He also knew the centrality of the keys, that the keys and the priesthood ordinances that they authorized must be, that the preparations must be left in place so they could all continue in his absence. I intend to show that Joseph Smith successfully conveyed all of the keys to Brigham Young and the 12, and not only the keys, but the necessary training and instruction, especially pertaining to temple ordinances. Also, that Brigham Young and the 12 had perfect confidence that they held all the keys and that no one else did. And that on the matter of authority and leadership, there were no serious rivals to the 12. No one else held all the keys. No one else had the confidence of most of the people. No one else knew the full program in detail. And therefore, no one else was in a position to seriously challenge their leadership. So now to our story. The Quorum of the 12 was organized for the first time in this dispensation in 1835. And by their ordination, the apostles in 1835 understood that they were receiving apostolic keys, or the keys of the kingdom, that empowered them to be special witnesses of Christ in all the world. They were a traveling high council to preside among the nations of the world outside the stakes of Zion. Joseph Smith instructed, prepared, trained these newly ordained members of the Quorum of the 12 about their role before they left on their first mission in May 1835. And before he left, he also gave them a detailed written instruction, which was soon published in the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants as Section 3 in that first publication. On Priesthood was the name of the revelation. It's our Section 107. This on priesthood instruction did indeed outline, as Joseph had already done, that they were a traveling high council, and they were to oversee the church abroad, and they were to take the gospel as witnesses of Christ in all the world. But it also foreshadowed another role for the 12. It said that they formed a quorum equal in authority and power to the quorum of the First Presidency. Not for now were they going to be regulating the affairs of the stakes of Zion. They were understood to preside abroad, but potentially united as a quorum, they stood equal in power and next to the First Presidency. During the 1830s, the 12 were firmly grounded in the abroad mission and responsibility. Indeed, there was sometimes tension between them and the presidency, between them and the High Council in the stakes of Zion. That got resolved over time as they had discussions and talked about their roles and responsibilities. But they were in the shadow of other officials throughout the 1830s until it changed dramatically in 1838 and 39 in Missouri. With the First Presidency in prison and the saints under attack and forced to leave on a winter exodus from Missouri, the Quorum of the 12 were the officials on the ground who had the authority, the confidence of the people, and the possibility of trying to regroup and get them started on their new journey to another place. Brigham Young took this in hand, and in December of 1838, he ordained 2 apostles that had been called by Joseph Smith earlier, but not ordained, John Taylor and John Page. And these apostles then began to organize the saints and prepare for the exodus from Missouri. The next month, in January 1839, Joseph Smith wrote to the saints from Liberty Jail, Joseph Smith and the Presidency, and it instructed, which turned out to be ratifying what they were already doing, with this in this language: inasmuch as we are in prison for a little season, if it need be, the management of the affairs of the church devolves upon you, that is, the 12. And of course, they were already doing that. And they successfully led the exodus from Missouri, taking the poor along and salvaging a very difficult situation to get the stragglers from Missouri into Quincy and other parts of Illinois. They then set about preparing for a long-awaited mission abroad. Again, their primary responsibility to take the gospel abroad. Elders Kimball and Hyde, in the midst of crisis, had left 2 years earlier and had a magnificent success in laying a foundation in Britain. And now the rest of the Quorum of the 12 were going there to build on what they had begun. Joseph Smith spent the summer preparing them, teaching them, so that they could, by the time they left, leave with a sense of solidarity and new purpose as a reorganized and reinvigorated Quorum of the 12 under the leadership of Brigham Young. One of the things that helped in that solidarity was Brigham Young gathering up his members and making the dangerous and some thought foolhardy and unnecessary trip back to Missouri to fulfill the revelation that the mob had declared Joseph Smith, on the grounds that Joseph Smith had been declared a false prophet because that revelation could not be fulfilled, that the 12 would leave from their mission 1 year since. This revelation was given in 1838, and they returned in April of 1839 to the Far West Temple site, where they ordained 2 more apostles, George A. Smith, also called by Joseph earlier, but not ordained, and Wilford Woodruff. In this renewed Quorum of the 12, fulfilling the prophecy of Joseph, gathering strength and solidarity as they risked Missouri and fulfilled Joseph's revelation, now returned to receive Joseph's blessings and final preparations before they left on their mission. They left at a time of illness, with their families destitute, and therefore it was a great sacrifice for them to leave on this mission. And it was a resounding success. They established a publishing enterprise, an immigration business. They established saints, branches of the saints all over the British Isles, tripling the membership of what had been there when they arrived. And in 1 year, they had a wonderful opportunity to learn what it meant to be apostles, carrying the keys of the kingdom to another country where they were responsible to the Lord and to Joseph for all of the things that had to be done to sustain the church and establish it in a foreign land. 7 of the 12 traveled there. In addition, Willard Richards had been called by Joseph, but not ordained because he was already serving in England. So he was ordained while they were over there. So 8 of the 12 served in England together, or in Great Britain. In April of 1841, a 9th joined them, Orson Hyde, on his way to Palestine. And in the councils and conferences to wrap up their mission after a year of service, for some of them a year and 3 months, in those conferences and councils, 9 members of the Quorum of the 12 were involved. The same men who would later, 3 years later, be involved in the preparations that Joseph made for his final conveying to the 12 the keys and responsibility and teachings they needed to lead in his absence. In Nauvoo, the 12 gained new responsibilities and new possibilities. I should say, however, before we do that Brigham Young always taught later that the Quorum of the 12 had all of the keys of the kingdom. That is, all the keys that pertain to men on earth were part of the office of the apostleship. That was not true, however, in 1835 when they were ordained apostles. It was not true, and we know that because in 1836, they were there in the temple at the time. Moses, Elias, and Elijah brought new keys, not to the Quorum of the 12, but to Joseph and to Oliver. So now there were keys that they did not have. They didn't get those keys in 1839 before they went to England. They didn't get those keys in 1841 when they returned. But something did happen in 1841 that started the ball rolling that would eventually lead to them receiving those keys. In January of 1841, Joseph received the great Nauvoo revelation. It's our section 124, given on the 19th of January, 1841. It described the spiritual and physical plan for the developing of Nauvoo. It began by saying that the Lord's house would be a place where one of its primary pillars was to establish Nauvoo as a temple city, and said that the house of the Lord would be established at the place that they had considered for that possibility, and that it would be a place where even the fullness of the priesthood and all those things taken away might be restored. In that house are the keys of the holy priesthood to be ordained. It'll be a house wherein I may reveal my ordinances unto my people, ordinances that had been hidden since the foundation of the world. The revelation also included instructions for specific individuals, none more important than the ones to Hiram. He was named patriarch of the church in the place of his father, Joseph, who had died not too long before. But he also was given another office of great importance and of great impact on his life. The revelation said that Joseph, the revelation, verse 95 in our current section 124, appointed the patriarch to be not only given the blessings of his deceased father, but all the blessings, honor, gifts of the priesthood that were once upon him that was my servant Oliver. Hiram now would receive the responsibilities that should have been Oliver's had he stayed with the church. Now, no one had all of the keys that had been restored to that point, except Oliver and Joseph, from the 3rd of April, 1836, until Oliver's excommunication in 1838. After Oliver's excommunication, Joseph alone held all the keys. Had he not come out of Missouri alive, those would have to have been restored again. They did, and the revelation now said those keys will go to Hiram. So that Hiram and Joseph will now hold all of the keys, and he would take the place as the second witness of priesthood restoration alongside Joseph, with all of the keys of the priesthood. We don't have a document that says the date on which Joseph gave Hiram the keys, but you can bet that he wasted no time. He'd had them alone, and now he could share them by direct revelation, was commanded to share them with his brother. The most sacred keys were connected to temple and temple ordinances. The sealing key, among those received on the 3rd of April, 1836, and sometimes called the final key, was an essential part of Joseph Smith's mission. It was central to his mission and one that would be central to the mission of anyone who would follow him. Now, when the Quorum of the 12 got back to Nauvoo in the summer of 1841, Joseph Smith was very much in need of help and assistance, and felt so strongly driven to get this help in the saddle that he decided not to wait till October conference, but to make what amounted to a constitutional change to bring the Quorum of the 12 into responsibility and leadership in the church itself, not just abroad, in August of 1841. On the 16th of August, he organized a special conference that would do this before the general conference in October. He needed the Quorum of the 12, who was now proven as a strong united quorum and administrative unit, and he needed them alongside him in the things that he knew that he had to accomplish. In this conference, he said he'd organized that conference so that at this time, the 12 should be authorized to assist in managing the affairs of the kingdom in this place, which he said was their duty and their office. The conference then voted to sustain the motion that the Quorum of the 12 be authorized to act in accordance to Joseph Smith's instructions in regulating and superintending the affairs of the church. Willard Richard noted in his diary, business of the church given to the 12. From this point on, over the next 3 years, no important initiatives, church-related, temple-related, Nauvoo-related, were undertaken with the First Presidency without consultation and assistance from the Quorum of the 12. Brigham Young and the Quorum of the 12 were at their side, not the side of Hiram and William Law for the most part, but not the side of Sidney Rigdon and William Law for the most part, but the side of Joseph and Hiram. The active presidency was Joseph and Hiram, with Brigham Young and the Quorum of the 12 at their side. And it foreshadowed then, it now put into place then what had been foreshadowed in section 107 of the Doctrine and Covenants, that they received their position next to the First Presidency in all things in leading the church. Now, if he's felt some urgency about getting the 12 in the saddle, where they would gain new experience and where he would get their help, he felt equal urgency about something else, and that was the need to advance his temple-related mission. He knew that he didn't have a lot of time. 6 weeks after he organized the Relief Society, he spoke to the Sisters of the Relief Society this way. He said, as he had this opportunity to be with them, to teach them, he was going to instruct the society, that he did not know as he should have many such opportunities of teaching them, that the church would not have his instruction long, and the world would not be troubled with him a long while. For according to his prayers, the Lord had appointed him elsewhere. Only 1 week later, he gathered a group of 9 men and gave them, quote, certain instructions regarding the priesthood. Joseph Smith's history shows us that this is the first temple-related endowment of this dispensation. He had concluded to begin preparing a group of men without waiting for the temple, who could officiate in the work of the temple when it was completed. His brother Hiram, of course, was there, and so were 3 members of the Quorum of the 12, Brigham Young, Willard Richard, and Heber Kimball. Elder Kimball was so excited about what he learned in this instruction from Joseph and Hiram that he wanted to share it with his fellow apostle, Parley Pratt, in England. But the things of the temple are not to be written, so he could only say a few things briefly and cryptically. Brother Joseph, he wrote to Parley, feels as well as ever I see him. One reason is he has got a small company that he feels safe in their hands, and that he can open his bosom to them and feel safe. I wish you were here so as to feel and hear for yourself. We have received some precious things through the prophet on the priesthood that would cause your soul to rejoice. So he needed this small group of confidants, including members of the Quorum of the 12, to begin to advance his temple-related mission. There's reason to think he would have expanded that to include other people and soon more ordinances that very year, but it was not to be. The eruption of scandal around the departure of John C. Bennett changed everybody's agenda that spring and summer. The agenda of Joseph Smith and Hiram, of the 12, of the hundreds of men who went out to preach and counter the publicity that had been stirred up by the lies and so-called disclosures of John C. Bennett. So nothing was done for more than a year to advance the temple agenda. But in late May, of 1843, Joseph assembled the same group, minus 2 men who were not there, including elders Young, Kimball, and Richards, to rehearse the same ordinances that they'd done the year before. And then, according to our best reconstruction, 3 days later, he introduced the first eternal marriages of this dispensation in May of 1829. Again, the 3 apostles participated. Nothing further was done about temple-related things until after Brigham Young and members of his quorum went on their summer missions. But Brigham Young understood that there was more to be done, including the fullness of the priesthood that was mentioned in the revelation of January 1841. And he apparently expected that might occur even while he was gone. He told an audience in Boston, "We have a portion of the priesthood, not all. The fullness of the priesthood is not in the church yet, or if it is, I do not know it." When he got home, he learned that indeed, as he expected might have occurred, Joseph had organized a group and had introduced the fullness of the priesthood ordinances that were foreshadowed in section 124 of the Doctrine and Covenants. Joseph did this on the 28th of September, 1843, when he and Emma became the head of a new group, a quorum, as they called it. Some of you will have heard this referred to as the Anointed Quorum. In 1845, Heber Kimball called it the Holy Order. But in Joseph's day, it was simply called the Quorum, or occasionally the First Quorum. It was the quorum, or the group, or the order of men and women who received temple ordinances outside the temple in preparation for the temple so they could officiate when the temple was completed. So at this gathering, Joseph and Emma were selected to head this new quorum, and they were ordained and anointed to the highest and holiest order of the priesthood, which was the fullness of the priesthood ordinance that Brigham Young had spoken of in Boston and anticipated. This was later administered to others. Eventually, 30 men and women received temple ordinances outside the temple in preparation for the temple. And these were the men and women under the direction of the 12, 3 of whom were involved in these things this fall, that were able to officiate in the Nauvoo temple for thousands of Latter-day Saints. Now, as you can imagine, Brigham Young learned about this as soon as he got back from his mission in late October. In November, he and his wife received the fullness of the priesthood ordinances. And then Joseph Smith told him that he should gather up all of the members of the Quorum of the 12, then in Nauvoo. These were the same 9 who had met for the first time in Great Britain in April of 1841. All of these men with their wives should now receive all of the ordinances under the direction of Brigham Young, president of the Quorum of the 12. This occurred in a series of meetings or ordinance sessions or councils, sessions of the Quorum, which were held between the 20th and the 31st of January, 1844. Joseph attended some of them, but not all. Brigham Young was left to do what Joseph had instructed him to do for his quorum, so that all of the quorum, then in Nauvoo, 9 men, received all of these ordinances. Now, in the history of priesthood restoration, it's the exception rather than the rule to know the date. We know the date of John the Baptist because Oliver Cowdery included it in a letter to W.W. Phelps, who printed it in the church's periodical, and Joseph picked it up in his history. We don't know the date for Peter, James, and John because Joseph Smith nor Oliver Cowdery ever gave us a date. I think Joseph intended to say, I know he intended to say more. I hope he intended to give us a date. When he wrote about this in his own history, he outlined 4 things that he would do, including the reception of the highest and holiest priesthood. And then he only completed in his history, this 1832 history, 2 of them, and never wrote about the other one. So we never knew. We don't have an exact date for the voice of God in the Father Chambers, the voice of God in Father Chambers, We do not have an exact date for the voice of God in the chamber of Father Whitmer, an experience that Joseph talked about a couple of times and was also important to him in this series of events of priesthood restoration. We almost didn't even have an account, let alone a date, of that great conferral of new keys in April of 1836 in the Kirtland Temple. Joseph Smith's regular scribe, who had kept his diary, the wonderful pre-temple diary in Kirtland, the best he ever kept, set down his pen 3 days before. But gratefully, Warren Cowdery picked it up, and Warren Cowdery wrote what is now our section 110, the account of the coming of Moses, Elias, and Elijah, giving more keys to Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery. Now, we don't know either when Brigham Young and the Quorum of the 12 received additional keys, other than the fullness of the priesthood accounts, which we do know. But we do have the formal account or testimony or proclamation, as he called it, of Parley Pratt, that Brigham Young did indeed receive the final key, the key of the sealing powers that were brought by Elijah in 1836. We know that he received it before the 26th of March, 1844, when Joseph Smith said to the Council of 50, "I have given to the 12 all of the keys that I have received." So he received these keys. Brigham Young would have either in preparation for or right after he and his quorum receiving the fullness of the priesthood ordinances. We can surmise that. Here's what the published proclamation of Parley Pratt proclaims. He described in some detail how Joseph Smith prepared the 12 with a series of meetings and councils with the ordinances and teachings that they needed, and said to them, "I know not why, but I am constrained to hasten my preparations and confer upon the 12 all the ordinances, keys, covenants, endowments, and sealing ordinances of the priesthood, so as to set them a pattern in all things pertaining to the sanctuary and the endowment therein." And then he continued, Pratt did. Joseph proceeded to confer on Elder Young, the president of the 12, the keys of the sealing power, as conferred on the last day by the spirit and power of Elijah. And he goes on to describe the importance of that key and what that power was. This, he said, was the last key of the priesthood, the most sacred of all, and pertained exclusively to the First Presidency of the church, without whose sanction no sealings or blessings administered by this power can be done. Now, when Brigham Young and the Quorum of the 12 returned to Nauvoo, and 5 members of the 12 returned to Nauvoo on the 6th of August, 1844, they understood perfectly well that they had received all of the keys of the kingdom. All the keys and authority that Joseph Smith had been given to them in preparation for, Wilford said, "We heard him say, but we did not know until he was gone that he meant he would not be with us. And we would not only carry the burden in the heat of the day, but we would carry the burden without him." When they met with Sidney Rigdon on the 7th of August in the evening, it was with the firm knowledge that he and his fellow quorum members held all the keys of the priesthood. When he stood before the saints the next afternoon seeking their sustaining vote, he explained to them what he called the power of the priesthood and the order thereof. He knew he had the keys. When they met with Sidney Rigdon on the 7th of April in the evening, Sidney gave them essentially the same story he'd given some of the saints in meetings before they arrived. He'd tried to press for the guardianship to be passed to him before the 12 returned. He'd expressed an urgency about getting back to Pittsburgh. They had to get it back to his family, and so they must do this quickly. But Parley Pratt and some of the other members of the 12 that were there before Brigham and his colleagues returned from the East were able to forestall this. When they sat down, Sidney explained that he had received this grand vision and that the guardianship was his because the church had to be built up to Joseph, and that he would see that it was governed properly, in the proper manner. Brigham's response: "I do not care who leads the church, but one thing I must know, and that is what God says about it. I have the keys and the means of obtaining the mind of God on the subject." These were the keys given to Hiram, the key to ask and receive. Brigham has that as well. Joseph conferred upon our heads all the keys and powers belonging to the apostleship, which he himself held before he was taken away. No man or set of men can get between Joseph and the 12 in this world or the world to come. How often has Joseph said to the 12, "I have laid the foundation and you must build upon it"? These became the 2 themes of Brigham Young's leadership in Nauvoo, his early leadership after the death of Joseph. He and his quorum had all the keys, and they therefore could and would build on the foundation Joseph Smith had laid. And he declared that no man or set of men could succeed against them because they had the keys. This was his message the next day before the saints on the 8th of August in the Grove. As he summarized in his diary, I laid before them the order of the priesthood. I laid before them the order of the church and the power of the priesthood. Minutes of this long and crucial meeting verify this view of what he said. They include things like this. If any man thinks he has influence, let him try, and he will find out there is power in the priesthood, and it will carry the 12 off victorious through all the world. The 12 are appointed by the finger of the Almighty. Here are the 12, an independent body who have the keys of the kingdom in all the world, so help me God, and they shall stand as the first presidency of the church. And this, I know where the keys of the kingdom are and where they will eternally be. The published minutes capture a little bit different statement of Brigham. He told the saints, sustain the 12, and we will direct all things aright. A very bold promise. But then he said, and why could he make that promise? Because he knew that he held the keys and the Lord was behind them. And then he said, if you choose not to sustain us, we will raise up a people who will, because we do have the keys and the power, and it is our responsibility. Young wrote to his daughter 3 days later, I simply set forth the power of the priesthood and the order thereof, upon which the whole church lifted up their voices and hands for the 12 to move forward and organize the church and lead it as Joseph led it, which it is our indispensable duty to do. After the almost unanimous sustaining vote, they wasted no time. The very next day, they appointed trustees and began to organize the church and oversee the church abroad and the church in Nauvoo. But their overarching goal was to find the means and the will to finish the temple and endow the saints. And, though it wasn't yet talked about publicly, to find a new home for the saints elsewhere. They understood that these were among all the measures of Joseph, that they were commissioned, that they were directed, that they were responsible to do. They sat down in their own council on the 27th of August. With 6 members of the 12 present, they formally voted. We will carry out all that Joseph views in all things. That was their responsibility. And the central message was, we have no new commandments. We beseech you to keep and honor and obey the old ones, including building the temple. They had the chance 1 week later at the farewell of Wilford Woodruff to give the same message to the saints publicly on Sunday, the 25th of August, that Joseph, the prophet and seer, ordained, anointed, and appointed the 12 to lead the church. This was what Elders Hyde and Pratt told the saints. He had given them the keys of the kingdom of God for that purpose. So recorded Wilford Woodruff in his diary. Now, after August 8th, a few had concerns about the leadership of the 12. And those concerns had as much to do with their views of Joseph's measures as it did about the authority of the 12. As I noted, those who supported Joseph Smith's late Nauvoo initiatives and believed that Joseph lived and died a prophet tended to support the 12. But some who loved Joseph but had not embraced some of his late Nauvoo measures sought an alternative to Brigham and the 12 precisely because they knew that the 12 intended to carry out all the measures of Joseph. Among those still concerned was Sidney Rigdon, who, contrary to his early protestations of haste, was still in Nauvoo. 1 month after the vote, it's instructive for us to look at what happened in the month following the vote with Sidney Rigdon. He, William Marks, and a few others started to get together to try and find some way to have an alternative to the 12 and maybe find a following. On Sunday, September the 1st, Elder Pratt and Elder Hyde testified in the meeting. On Sunday, September the 1st, one Sunday after the apostles had testified that Joseph had prepared the 12 to lead by giving them all the keys, Rigdon gave what Young characterized in his own diary as a very complicated and somewhat scattered speech about his revelations and about the great battles that were to come. But he didn't say anything practical about what needed to be done in the church, which was what the 12 intended to do. In fact, Rigdon did profess to be one with the people and seemed to support the temple and moving forth building Nauvoo. But on Tuesday, 2 days later, the 12 learned that that was not his intention at all. For on Monday, the day after his public sermon, seeming to profess unity with the saints and support for the temple, he began to ordain and organize a set of people around him who would challenge the 12. On Tuesday, the 12 learned of these secret meetings, secret ordinations and ordinances that Rigdon had done the night before. And so they went that afternoon to confront him. At first, he deflected their questions and tried to deny it, and finally admitted, yes, he had done ordinations. And I have authority above yours and don't see myself submitting to your counsel, he told them. They left and held a council of their own, and the Quorum of the 12 decided they would demand the license of Sidney Rigdon. So 3 of the 12 went back that evening and told Sidney that it was necessary that he give up his license, that he could no longer serve as a minister of the gospel. This angered, and they also told him that there would be a public trial the Sunday following where he would be tried for his membership. This angered him, and he lashed out. The church had not been led for a long time by the Lord, he told the 3 apostles. He knew that now, and he would publish all that he knew against the 12 and expose all the secrets of the church. A few days later, they learned that the group around Rigdon intended to send people into the branches and try to pull them away from the 12. They counseled among each other to go slow, though, insinuating that Joseph and Hiram was wrong, because, if you come out too strong, the feelings of the people about the prophet are pretty strong and you will sink our endeavor. Well, if we had time, there's much to be learned from the 6-hour trial on the 8th of September of 1844 of Sidney Rigdon. But those 6 hours of testimony, we can only summarize in a few statements. One is the 12 were very strong about their testifying again of all of the times that Joseph had prepared them, had given them the keys, had told them that they would have to lead in his absence, and had prepared them by counsel after counsel and instruction after instruction. They also talked about the Quorum that was organized on the 28th of September 1843. And they indicated that one of the teachings Joseph said in that Quorum was all new revelations, including his own, would come first to the Quorum. That is, the men and women who had been endowed would have the chance first to read, to pray, to pronounce on the validity of revelations. And Orson Hyde said to the crowd on the 8th of September about Sidney Rigdon, Sidney Rigdon did not bring his revelation to that Quorum, as Joseph had instructed he should. Now, that comes up again when William Marks attempts to defend Sidney Rigdon. Most of the testimony is that of the 12, laying out their own calling and keys and responsibility and training and authority, and describing what they'd learned about Sidney Rigdon's plans, his secret plans to try and scatter the church and pull them away from the temple and the measures of Joseph. But one person stood up to speak for Sidney, and that was William Marks, president of the stake, a veteran of many councils. And he talked about the precedent of the councils and the Doctrine and Covenants, saying that the councils represent both sides, the accused and the accusers. And he was going to stand up and represent Sidney Rigdon the best he could. His strongest case was that Sidney Rigdon was a member of the First Presidency, and the First Presidency should stand alongside the 12. And therefore, Sidney Rigdon has authority with the 12, if not above the 12. For he said, I know, for I was there, that Sidney was ordained a prophet, seer, and revelator. This had to do with what happened in the fall of 1843, when Joseph had tried to shake Sidney off of him. That is, he complained that Sidney had not been a faithful counselor, had not been his assistant and associate, had not been in the meetings. And being an unprofitable counselor, it was time to move on. Hiram's heart was broken. We cannot lose Sidney, the old warhorse Sidney who's been with us from the beginning. We have to retain him. And he pleaded with Joseph and then with the church. And when the vote came, the church voted to retain Sidney. After the meeting, Hiram continued to plead with Joseph. You must ordain him. You must give him authority with us so that he can be one of the prophets, seers, and revelators, and we can bring him back into the fold and save Brother Sidney. And so apparently this ordination was done. William Marks says, I don't know of anybody else now who living who has that ordination. The response of the 12 is, Brigham Young and the 12 received all of the keys and ordinances that Joseph had and that could be given on earth. And, said Brigham, I always knew Brother Marks only knew what was written. And if you know only what is written, there are many things, Brother Marks, you will never know. For there are things that we received from Joseph and with Joseph that are not in your books, and that are not in the Doctrine and Covenants, including the teachings of the temple, of course. Well, William Marks allowed that this was a proper trial and that he would give the best defense he could, but of course, the president of the bishop, who is the president of the council, and the council would render their verdict. And the verdict was that Sidney Rigdon and several of his associates would no longer be members of the church. Now, I should mention that Brother Marks also brought up an excuse for why Sidney Rigdon had not brought his revelation to the quorum, as Joseph had instructed. He didn't do that because he didn't know of that instruction. He was not a part of that quorum, but for one time when Brother Phelps brought him in. He only had one session with the endowment group, and it didn't include the higher teachings that William Marks was a part of and that the Quorum of the 12 received later. After the trial of Sidney Rigdon, peace and calm settled over Nauvoo. The October conference was one of voting to sustain the 12 and all the new officers, all the officers of the church, and voting to sustain them in carrying out all the measures of Joseph. As Heber Kimball said in conference, it is our responsibility to carry out all the measures of Joseph, and you must do it with us. The message to the saints in the conference was, the keys are here, the church will go forward, we're going to build on this foundation that Joseph laid, and all the things that he intended, we will see done because he's left us the keys, the authority, and the teachings to do that. Under the 12 in Nauvoo, the church prospered. The city was strong. The temple went forward. There was more unity and peace than there'd been for a very long time because there'd been so many dissenters and so much adversity during the last few months of Joseph's life. Elder Kimball wrote in January 1845, 6 months after Joseph's death, there never was more union in the church than at the present time. By the time of General Conference in April 1845, observers talked about the energy, strength, unity, and record numbers attending the conferences, and noting that more work had been done on the temple than had been done in any previous length of time. W.W. Phelps wrote about a paradise summer, and said, under the management of the 12, everything has flourished so visibly that no man can doubt that the Lord reigns with the saints at Nauvoo. In the words of Orson Pratt, love, peace, union, and oneness of the saints in the West, meaning in Nauvoo, have never been surpassed since the rise of this kingdom. And then he went on to explain why. In Pratt's view, there was so much unity because the people had confidence in their leaders, especially in Brigham Young. Everything flourishes under his administration. Young, for his part, acknowledged that the Lord had blessed them and that months of shared counsel and shared prayer had strengthened and united them as a quorum. According to Heber Kimball, the quorum itself was so united that no contrary disposition among us at all is ever visible. We are of one heart and mind, and when we are called together, it is quite a job to separate us. Now, I want to conclude by talking about how the Quorum of the 12 used the keys connected to the temple to bless the saints in the last part of their administration in Nauvoo. For one of the reasons for peace and unity was prayer, what might be called priesthood prayer. I once wrote an article called Defending the Kingdom Through Prayer, which explored what B.H. Roberts called the greatest period of prayer in the history of the church. This period after the death of Joseph, where the Quorum of the 12, using the priesthood keys associated with the temple and priesthood pattern of prayer taught in the temple, used those keys and powers to deter opponents long enough to finish the temple and endow the saints. These were the same keys, again, that Hiram received and that section 124 talks about, the keys whereby one may ask and receive. These were exercised by the Quorum of the 12 and other faithful saints who had received the endowments on behalf of the saints in Nauvoo. Brigham Young wrote to Wilford Woodruff this way: the members of the Quorum of the 12 who are in Nauvoo and one or two others have regularly met for some time back to offer up our prayers and thanksgiving agreeable to the order of the Holy Priesthood, priesthood prayer, for the salvation of the saints and the peace of the saints, and also that the Lord would overrule all matters so that we might be permitted to dwell in peace until we could finish the temple, and the brethren get their endowments. For this we have supplicated day and night, and we have been prospered in a way beyond our most sanguine expectations. You will see that by this letter that God has answered our prayers. One example only. Brigham Young urged people to care for their crops, but also, when necessary, leave them in the hands of God to build the temple. If you come to the temple and your crops are left in his hands, they will not suffer, he promised them. And then by priesthood prayer, tried to recognize and realize the promise. But by midsummer, the crops were in trouble. It was a very hot and dry summer, and rain was urgently needed. On the 10th of July, 1845, Brigham Young, Heber Kimball, and others of the 12 got together and petitioned the Lord that we would finally have rain so that our crops might be saved. 3 days after this prayer, this special priesthood prayer, Kimball wrote, it began to rain in the morning, so very hard, a beautiful shower. This was in answer to our prayer of the 10th. It continued raining all night. Time after time, they felt their prayers were answered as they used priesthood keys to petition the Lord to protect the saints. Only once did Brigham Young waver in his commitment to finish the temple, at whatever the cost. It was their commission and their desire that the saints receive their endowments, and they intended to do it. However, despite quiet and peace in Nauvoo and in Hancock County, in January of 1845, Young learned of an imminent threat of violence, as former Latter-day Saints were attempting to stir up violence to drive them from Nauvoo before the temple could be finished. He recorded this in January the 23rd in his diary. That former Latter-day Saint leader Wilson Law had lectured the mob and told them that they must drive the Mormons from Nauvoo before the temple was done or they never could. Or in the words Brigham used when he wrote to Wilford Woodruff about this a little later, Law is preaching about the country. They must remove the Mormons before they finish the temple, for if they don't, all hell cannot move them, for they are so attached to the temple. And indeed they were. But ironically, plans were already underway to find a new home for the saints once the temple was finished. But leaving before the temple was finished was unthinkable. Young and the 12 had been unequivocal about this. But even at the cost of bloodshed, Brigham Young is often thought of as militant in his language, and he was, but he was not a violent man. When later in the year, mobs did come against some of the saints, Brigham's advice was we would rather suffer wrong than do wrong. He did not want to, despite his militant language, and despite boasting that he would finish the temple with a trowel in one hand and a sword in the other if it were necessary, he did not want to preside over violence. And so now he was faced with the prospect. What would you do? He would go to the Lord and find out. He, Heber Kimball, Bishop Whitney, joined together in priesthood prayer, inquired of the Lord, this is Brigham's diary account, whether we should stay here and finish the temple. The subtext, even if it means violence? And the answer was we should. And from that moment on, he displayed no doubt that they would leave before the temple was finished. They would leave, but not until the saints were endowed. It would be done, come what may. Now, since I published on this topic some years ago, one important new source has become available, the minutes of the Council of 50. Before the minutes were published, Kathleen Flake, chair of Mormon Studies program at the University of Virginia, received a pre-publication copy for a symposium. In her paper, she conveyed a central impression. Her surprise at the degree of unity and solidarity in the council behind Young and the 12, and the almost seamless continuity in measures discussed in the council. She thought, with some surprise, that the minutes showed surprising support for apostolic succession. They do indeed show continuity and support for Brigham Young and the Quorum of the 12. The same purpose and views and programs that were done under Joseph continued under Brigham in the Quorum of the 12. And they had a clear sense in reorganizing the Quorum of the 12 and moving forward that they were doing what Joseph Smith intended, carrying out all the measures of Joseph. When they reorganized the Council of 50, Brigham invited each member of the council to express his view about what ought to be done. Nearly everyone said in some measure what Samuel Bent said. He feels that it would be highly satisfactory to him to have President Young take the place of Brother Joseph as chairman and carry out Joseph's measures. Except for the campaign for presidency, which of course ended with Joseph's death, they continued the measures of Joseph in the Council of 50. And it's one more witness, if you will, of apostolic succession as Kathleen Flake saw the minutes. Now, in that reorganized quorum, reorganized in February of 1845, 1 month later, in March of 1845, the 25th of March, this would be 6 weeks after its reorganization, the council discussed a statement prepared by Orson Hyde that he wanted the council to finalize, endorse, and sign so that it could be published to the world as part of what he called his farewell to Rigdonism. He was preparing a pamphlet to lay out what he saw as the perfidy and plans of Sidney Rigdon. His account spoke of the preparation of the 12 for leadership, including their having received additional keys, and Joseph Smith's statement to the council that he had given all of the keys he had received from heaven to the 12. And he wanted members of the council who had witnessed that to sign that Joseph had indeed so charged and witnessed to the 12 their responsibilities. Brigham Young would have none of it. Yes, he agreed, Hyde should finish and publish his farewell to Rigdonism. But he decreed that it could not include any statement about keys and authority of the 12. It would have no public attestation to what a few had witnessed privately in the council. He made clear that no paper could add to or diminish the power and authority of the Quorum of the 12. His final words on the subject will also be ours tonight. He said, "I don't care if the world know the power and authority of the 12 or not. I shall not try to prove it to them. When the time comes, they shall feel our power." Thank you for the opportunity to revisit this subject with some additional research that the Joseph Smith Papers makes available, including the Council of 50 Minutes. I feel like Joseph knew very much when he went into Nauvoo that his time was short and he had to prepare the 12 to finish the work in his absence. And I testify that he did the work that he prepared to do, that he gave them the teachings, the keys, the authority, and the ordinances that could be continued after his death, so that the saints could receive them all in the Nauvoo temple and beyond, and so that we could be blessed by them today. I know that the apostles hold these keys, that Joseph Smith saw them as the way to continue the legacy after he and Hiram were gone, and that he prepared the way that that might happen. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.
Our dear Heavenly Father, we're grateful to have heard the testimony and the history tonight that reaffirm the continuity of succession between the prophet Joseph Smith and Brigham Young and the apostles. We're grateful for the efforts of Brother Esplin and all those who've contributed to the history of the church in the Joseph Smith Papers project and in other projects, so that this history can be made known to all in its truthfulness and in its fullness. We pray, Father, that we'll take what we've heard tonight to heart. We pray also that thou wilt bless and support and sustain and help us to sustain those who hold the keys today and have continued them in our time, including our prophet, President Russell M. Nelson. Bless each one of us to listen to and follow those who have been called with keys to lead us during this crucial and difficult time in which we live. We ask these blessings and express our gratitude again for what we've heard tonight. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.
All right. There's several questions that we might address. One is, what evidence do we have that Joseph Smith gave the final key to Hiram? That's one of those things in priesthood history that we have all the information around and no specific date or document. There's no question that Joseph Smith would have moved immediately after the direction of Section 124 to see that he was not the only holder of those keys. And he and Joseph and Hiram together presided over the church in Nauvoo as almost joint presidents. Clearly, Joseph was the first, but Hiram, as many acknowledge, had he lived in the absence of Joseph, would have continued in the presidency in a way that Sidney Rigdon could not. So there's no question in my mind that this final key was given to Hiram immediately after the revelation, but we do not have hard evidence. We do have the proclamation of Parley Pratt that Brigham Young received it from Joseph Smith, but we don't have the date. We only have the testimony of Elder Pratt. One of the questions is, where can we read more about this? The folks that put together this fireside series intend that we should expand this, elaborate a little bit on what we've done in our oral presentations and put them together in a book. So I think this will be published, and I have written it in a way that I can finalize it and publish it. And the written version will have additional information beyond what I could deal with today, including some considerable discussion of the 6-hour trial of Sidney Rigdon. So there will be a way to get more information out of the book, which I assume that we'll try to get together this winter and get out next year. Is that correct, Jeff?
That's correct.
What evidence do we have that Joseph Smith anticipated that the First Presidency would eventually be reorganized? I think the pattern of Section 107 is clear, and I think the practical reasons and also the historical discussions that the Quorum of the 12 engaged in before they reorganized in 1847 help us understand that this was probably the plan all along. I would reverse this a little before I try to answer that question more directly and say, why did the 12 wait so long before they reorganized the First Presidency? And the reason for that is that they had been given a commission as a quorum. They were united as a quorum. They were instructed as a quorum. They were given the keys as a quorum. They were given the ordinances as a quorum. And the commission was, you will carry the burden in the heat of the day when I am gone. And until they had done that, finished the temple, endowed the saints, found a new home for the saints in the West, I don't think they were ready to reorganize. Brigham Young said later, I knew from the day Joseph died that the First Presidency must be. And then when he finally, in the fall of 1847, on the way back from Salt Lake Valley to winter quarters, started to talk about reorganizing, he said, from the moment I left the valley, in other words, we've finished the temple, we've endowed the saints, we've found the new settling place in the West. From the time I left the valley, the Spirit has whispered, reorganize. Now, when they had the discussions in the Quorum of the 12, Orson Pratt was very reluctant to have 3 called out of their number to preside over the 12. He said, we've been such a strong, united body, and he gave an interesting image. We have whipped the apostates with one hand behind our back. Now, what did he mean by that? Well, William Marks, on behalf of Sidney Rigdon, had declared we have to have a First Presidency, and he's the only remaining member, so we must have him. He's the prophet, seer, and revelator. And James J. Strang organized the First Presidency and a Quorum of the 12, and they had only the 12 because they were not going to reorganize till they'd finished their Quorum Commission. And so, Orson Pratt says, we licked the apostates with one hand to hide behind our back, an imperfect organization. Why call 3 out now? And Brigham says, because the Quorum of the 12 is going to go to all the world. And we're going to reorganize the Quorum of the 12. And we'll have a presidency at home, which is the practical way. And we'll go forward with the pattern that Section 107 gives us. I will say one interesting little tidbit here. Soon after the Quorum of the 12 was sustained as the presidents of the church, they internally made an executive committee. It's only recorded a note here or two, once or twice, but they appointed an executive committee so when the 12 could not be together, the executive committee could act. That didn't act very often as an executive committee because the 12 were together so often in Nauvoo throughout this period. Who was the executive committee? Brigham Young, Heber Kimball, Willard Richards, who became the First Presidency when they reorganized in winter quarters in December of 1847. It's interesting that one of the questions is what specific power and authority are contained in the final sealing key that was given to Brigham Young and the 12. I know some of my associates who have studied the keys and have studied the Old Testament and have studied the information from church history are not certain that we understand perfectly well what Elijah, Elias, and Elias and Moses brought. That some of the sealing power may be associated with Elias, some would argue. At any rate, I think what we know is what Parley Pratt said, that the final key is that spirit and power of Elijah that pertains only to the First Presidency, and that it is unlike other keys. It's unlike other keys in this sense. The Quorum of the 12 hold all of the keys, but only one man at a time can authorize sealings, and that's the president of the church. It was true with Joseph. Hiram was not to do it without Joseph's permission. It was true of Brigham. The apostles were not to do it without Brigham's permission. It was true of our own First Presidency in our day, where our First Presidency controls who gets those keys and who can use them and how they're used. In Brigham Young's papers, we have little slips of paper where he authorizes Heber Kimball to use the key to seal this brother or this sister. So they took very seriously the idea that it was different than other keys, that only one man holds it actively at a time on earth, and that it's held by all of the 12, but it's only active in the senior apostle, who has the responsibility for authorizing all sealings. Now, William Smith tried to argue contrary to that. He was excommunicated in 1845, a year after Sidney Rigdon, for not following the counsels of the 12, specifically over the sealing key. He claimed the right as an apostle to do as he chose, and he was claimed the right to seal who he chose, including unauthorized plural marriages. Brigham Young wrote him a very interesting letter on the 10th of August, 1845, in which he says, "Yes, you are an apostle. So am I. Yes, Hiram held the keys. So do you. But Hiram couldn't without Joseph, and you cannot without the Quorum of the 12, the president of the Quorum of the 12, and that is I. You cannot exercise the sealing key except by my permission." So we have some early documentation that they understood very clearly that the sealing key was different than others. And if we look at how it's used today, I think we can say that's still true. Well, I believe that's, let's see. What kind of things did Joseph Smith do specifically to prepare and to tutor Brigham Young in his eventual role as a successor? I would suggest two things. Number one, nothing of importance in Nauvoo after 1841 occurred where Brigham Young and the Quorum of the 12 were not involved. So what did Joseph Smith do specifically? He involved them in every major initiative of importance. I would turn that around and say, what did Brigham Young do to prepare? He took very seriously from the very beginning his responsibility to be a disciple. I've written an article about Joseph Smith and Brigham Young and discipleship. And the point of the article is Brigham was a better disciple than a leader. And he was only a leader later and a good leader later because he'd been such a strong and good disciple. Brigham said, "An angel never watched Joseph closer than I did. From the first moment I came into this kingdom, I never missed an opportunity to learn at the feet of Joseph." That was true at Zion's camp. It was true when he went to Kirtland to hear Joseph preach. It was true in Nauvoo, where he took every opportunity to sit in council with Joseph and listen. So I would say Joseph gave him the opportunities, and Brigham was a superb student in learning from Joseph. An angel never watched him closer, and that is the beginning of me knowing how to lead Zion. That's the way Brigham saw it. Well, I think we've covered the questions, and enjoyed being with you. I hope this is useful, and we can perhaps get this into print so more people can have an opportunity to read about it.